Thank you, Maria. Thanks to the Fundación Rafael del Pino for this invitation. Thanks to Vicente and Amadeo. And thanks to the publisher, Debate, for inviting me to moderate this debate. And of course, to Professor Collier for bringing your book and your arguments to Madrid, to this audience. It's an honor to, as a reader, as a professor, in the name of my students who read your books as course assignments, it's an honor to be here. And, maybe the first reflection would be about, the first question is, why this book? This is a very personal book for those of us who follow your trajectory. We see that you left Sheffield, you went global, you went to Africa, you've written on the bottom billion, you've written on democracy in Africa, but you seem to be coming closer to your origins. And in fact, in this book, there is a lot of about Sheffield, your origins, and this connection that you're trying to make. I've checked the distance. It's 143 miles trip from Sheffield to Oxford. It's just less than 3 hours. Yeah. But in this kind of 143 miles of distance, you seem to conflate all the problems of capitalism combined with your personal trajectory. So tell us a bit, why this book? Why is it so personal? What made you launch this book in the first place? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. First, just let me say, and thank you to the audience for coming on such an English evening. I feel quite at home. What the book is about is two social rifts which began around 1980 and got wider and wider over the last 40 years. And this is agonizingly true in Britain, but it's also true in most of the advanced economies. And one is a spatial rift between booming metropolitan areas, London, Madrid, Barcelona, and periodically broken provincial cities and towns. And the other new rift is between the very well educated, who on the back of that good education have developed sophisticated skills which have become more and more valuable, leaving behind people who didn't get a good education and so invested in manual skills. And those manual skills have become less and less valuable. And so the spatial rift and the new educational rift, and they interact, because if you're a bright kid from a broken region, you get out and you go to the metropole. And that compounds the problems in the regions that are left behind. So why is it a passionate book? Because as it happens, it describes my own life. I straddle both of those divides. I now live in the ultimate metropolitan success zone. My postcode where I live has the highest ratio of house prices to income in the whole country, because the rest of my street, I bought my house a long time ago, the rest of my street has filled up with London bankers. But I didn't grow up there. I grew up in Sheffield. And Sheffield became an emblematic broken city. Some of the people in your audience will have seen the very poignant film, The Full Monty. That's Sheffield, right? And it's funny, because Yorkshire has a sense of humor, but it's agonizing. And that was my relatives losing their jobs. And so I've lived that spatial rift with one foot in hyper-metropolitan success and one foot with my relatives in a broken city. Sheffield had been a steel town for 700 years. The famous poem Chaucer, there's a knife and it says it's the Sheffield knife. You know? And it was broken in about 5 years in the early 1980s as the steel industry moved to South Korea. And so that was globalization in action. And then the other rift, the educational rift, well, I've been lucky enough to get quite a lot of education. You know, I've got education coming out of my ears, really. I had chairs in Harvard, Oxford, and Paris. I've still got 2 of them. But that doesn't describe my family. Both my parents left school when they were only 12. I doubt if there's anybody in this room as parents with less education than that, right? And so I was lucky, but I was the only one in my family that was lucky. And the book is unusual in that it's got a photograph inside it. And the photograph is of 2 little children aged 4. And those 2 little children were born on the same day. And one is me, and the other is my cousin. And my cousin's life derailed when she was a teenager. Her father died, and she became a pregnant teenager, and that rolls on so that the next generation, her 2 daughters, also became teenage mothers. And that produced a deepening spiral down into catastrophe. And so my wife and I took the 3rd generation when they were aged 1 and 2, and they're now 12 and 13. And so one is on the cover of the book. And so I've lived this bitter divide, and so that's what gives the book a tinge of passion and indeed anger, because I think these rifts are avoidable. We've done nothing about them for 40 years. They've got wider and wider, and eventually they have produced a mutiny by the left behind. The people with poor education in provincial left-behind areas have mutinied. That's Brexit, that's Trump, that's the Gilets jaunes. I live part of the year in a very poor area of rural France, and my local town, which is a broken town, is one of the epicenters of the Gilets jaunes. Now, like all mutinies, it didn't come with solutions. It's just an expression of anger. Right? The most famous mutiny of all time, Mutiny on the Bounty, was provoked by the fact that the sailors were transporting some breadfruit back from the Pacific to Britain, and the captain, there was only a limited amount of drinking water, and the captain gave priority, saying, no, it's the plants that need that drinking water, not you sailors. Right? And eventually, the sailors decided that wasn't their priority, right? And so they mutinied. And I can't say that I blame them, frankly. Right? What they didn't mutiny for was to end up on a little island in the middle of nowhere, Pitcairn. But that's what happened. Right? And it may well be that that's what happens as a result of Brexit. We end up in a little island in the middle of nowhere. Right? That's not what the mutiny was about. It wasn't a forward-looking strategy against Brussels. It was nothing to do with Brussels. It was an expression of rage against the disdain and neglect of the metropolitan well-educated. So that's the anger in the book.
Okay, let's talk about this anger, because I think this is there is apparently a culprit which is capitalism. You know, but not without getting kind of too academic into definitions and so on. But what is it? I mean, if the culprit is capitalism, you know, what is it capitalism? What do you refer? What do you mean by that? People talk about market economy. Is it globalization? Is unfettered capitalism? What is the culprit? How do we recognize it when we see it?
Yeah. So capitalism, as we know it, is a system that's been around for about 250 years. Right? So it's pretty recent in the scale of human civilization, which is about 10,000 years. And in all that 10,000 years, we've only hit on one system which has proved capable of lifting living standards dramatically, and that is capitalism. Right? We've never discovered another system. And what I mean by capitalism is a combination of the ability to harness economies of scale and specialization, which we do with firms. For most of that 10,000 years of human history, the basic unit of production was just the household. No scale, no specialization, doomed to low productivity and poverty. So firms are an essential element of capitalism. And then the genius of capitalism is that it combines a degree of discipline from competition, so that decision-taking is decentralized to firms that are disciplined by a degree of competition, but it also permits a lot of collaboration between firms, so that firms can build networks of cooperation. If we look at Airbus, Airbus is a huge cooperation across Europe, many different firms, long-term collaboration based not on competition, but on trust and mutual collaboration. And it's been hugely successful. And so capitalism, the good features of capitalism, combines this decentralization, a capacity for collaboration, discipline of competition, scale and specialization. We've only tried one other system which managed scale and specialization, and that was Soviet communism. Whatever you accuse that system of, you can't fault it on scale. Right? It did big. It didn't work. It didn't work because it didn't do the decentralized decision-taking, the discipline of competition, and so on. Right? So I believe capitalism's a valuable system, but it doesn't work on autopilot. That's the vital thing about it. Periodically, it derails. It's like a train that comes off the rails. And in the 250 years of capitalism, it's derailed really badly at least 3 times. You all know the second derailment, the 1930s mass unemployment. The third derailment is what we're living through now, these 2 big rifts that started around 1980. And maybe I could talk for a few moments about the first derailment, because it's quite revealing. And the first derailment happened in the industrial towns where I grew up, Northern England, because that was the birth of capitalism. The first factory on Earth is 10 miles from where I was born. It's now a World Heritage Center because it was the first. And I'm going to take you just for 2 or 3 minutes to the most successful city in the whole of Europe in the mid-19th century. It was Boomtown, and that was called Bradford, a town not far from Sheffield. In fact, where my German grandfather migrated from an impoverished German village to Boomtown. And I'm going to take you there in the 1840s, because that's with the big derailment. Bradford was hugely productive, but it produced living conditions that are as close to hell as we've ever got outside conditions of warfare. And the reason living conditions collapsed was that people were herded together in very poor living conditions with no public infrastructure to separate water, drinking water, from sewage. And so I'm going to take you to Bradford in 1849. In 1849, Bradford was run by Mr. Big. It's called Titus Salt. He owned most of the mills. He was also politically totally important. He was the mayor of the city, and he was the city's MP, right? So, big industrialist, the main industrialist, and the main politician. And in 1849, when he was mayor, what happened was cholera. Right? People started dying in their hundreds, right? Life expectancy in the northern cities fell to just 19 years. On average, you were dead at 19. Right? This was hell. Right? And that experience of being responsible, the mayor, the MP, the employer, that seems to have seared Titus Salt's soul, because it transformed him. He became the first massive philanthropist on earth. He gave away his entire fortune. Partly he recognized he got obligations to his workforce. They were living in appalling conditions, so he built a complete new town for them. He used Titus Salt. This is called Saltaire. That's also a World Heritage Center because it was the first on earth. Yeah? He then recognized his obligations to his citizens, the community, so the rest of his fortune he spent cleaning up Bradford. Yeah? And people responded. His workforce was loyal. The community celebrated him as a hero. So that was Bradford. And that was responsible business. Yeah? Recognizing obligations and those obligations being returned by loyal citizens and loyal workforce. We go a few miles from Bradford and we get to Rochdale. I don't know if anybody knows what happened in Rochdale. Still in the 1840s, it's the birth of the world's cooperative movement. Because these same anxieties, families, households decide, let's do something about it. And what they do is build mutual obligations. I'll accept obligations towards you if you hit hard times, if you accept obligations to me. One of the things you're very worried about in Rochdale in the 1840s is, do I get a funeral? Right? And so the cooperative movement becomes the largest funeral director in the whole country. Very practical solutions to new anxieties thrown up by capitalism. Okay? Go a little way further, another town, Halifax. Where are you going to live? Halifax produced a building society, a mutual. You save, as you save, other people borrow and they buy a house. In turn, you are able to borrow. The Halifax Building Society became the biggest bank in Britain. So that was the 1840s. And what you see is widely distributed sense of moral load-bearing. Business is morally load-bearing. Families are morally load-bearing. Philanthropists, local community, as well as the state. It's widely distributed, pragmatic approaches to the new anxieties. And by pragmatism, I mean look at the new anxieties, study the context, and experiment. There is no guidebook to utopia, and indeed, there is no utopia. Pragmatism believes you just periodically things will go wrong. The best you can hope is to study the context, fix them up for a while. And that's the nature of capitalism. It periodically derails. When it derails, you need to pragmatically do something about it. And the peculiarity of the present derailment is that we haven't done anything about it. We've let it rip for 40 years.
So what has happened, because as you described, there was a golden age of capitalism based from 1940 to 1970, maybe a bit later, and then based on moral obligations, reciprocity, Maybe people would say that this is a bit of an Eurocentric. I mean, capitalism was working in Europe, but wasn't working maybe for others. It has worked later for others, maybe, but we can discuss that. I want to make of this a central point. But it worked for Europeans during that time. But then what went wrong, or what has gone wrong, to the point to which you claim that capitalism is morally bankrupt?
Yeah. I mean, it also worked in North America, to be fair, in the same period, right? And I grew up as a beneficiary of this new structure in which the rich accepted obligations to the poor. I was born in a National Health Service hospital 2 years after it had been started. I went to a free but very good school just a few years after it had been created. And when I got to Oxford as a student, my education was free. So I was a beneficiary of that structure of reciprocal obligations in which the rich accepted really very burdensome taxation. Income tax rates in Britain were over 80% for the high-income groups at that time. And the rich accepted that because, having come through the war together, there was this sense of us. We could talk meaningfully about we. And so the rich looked at the poor and saw themselves as there but for the grace of God go I, and so I accept obligations to them. What we've seen in recent years, as inequalities have grown, we've seen, and so the need for support has increased. Instead, we've seen the metropolitan well-educated peeling off from shared identity with everybody else. And I'll give you one graphic expression of that. There's a very good metropolitan commentator, writes for the Financial Times, and he did an article giving his own views and also metropolitan views of what provincial Britain looks like from London. And he said, it feels like being shackled to a corpse. You hear the empathy? You hear the fellow feeling, the concern? No, nor do I, right? If he'd said that about any of the fashionable victim groups, he'd have been out of a job in 2 days. But he could describe provincial Britain as being shackled to a corpse. In other words, we don't want anything to do with you. We're shackled, we want to sever the relationship with you. And you're a corpse, there isn't any solution to you, you just hurry up and be buried. And there was no reaction to that. But that is actually an appalling level of disdain for people who are angry, feel abandoned, with some justification. So that's the peeling off.
Now, so apart from this emancipation of the rich, probably from the poor and from other environments, if there is a subtitle probably to your book is that the future of capitalism is about ethics, right? And
that's right.
Which points maybe to something which people would think is controversial or even counterintuitive to some, is that the idea of bringing to a kind of ethical capitalism. But what you try and do in this book is to say, well, capitalism may not be ethic in itself, but it can work ethically if it's the state, the firm, and the family that work together to bring about an ethical capitalism. So,
yeah,
how do you put this together?
I'd add also the local communities. There are many. We need a lot of levels of morally load-bearing organizations. Humans have evolved to be naturally to form cooperative groups in which they build trusting relationships. Modern evolutionary biology has established that we are wildly more pro-social than any other related species. The distinctive thing about Homo sapiens is how pro-social, how willing we are to build systems of mutual trust. My own subject to economics has catastrophically got that wrong. It's misread evolution it seems to believe that we've evolved so as to be just greedy, selfish, lazy people, which we haven't. There's a tiny minority of people called psychopaths who are like that, about 3%, but modern economics is really built on the assumption that the entire society is filled only by psychopaths, and then the theorems of economics are exploring under what conditions is a society made up entirely of psychopaths not disastrous. And the answer, the truthful answer of the theorems of economics is circumstances which are so fanciful we know it can't exist. Right? But that mind view that humans are greedy, lazy, and selfish and nothing else, pervaded from economics into theories of business. And so Milton Friedman comes up with the proposition the only obligation of the firm is to make money for shareholders, because then markets will sort it all out. Right? And the firm itself, one very fashionable theory of the firm that became very fashionable was the firm itself was a fiction. The firm didn't really exist other than as a structure of legal contracts between the firm and its workforce that signed a contract, and the behavior of people in that firm was specified in detail. This is what you've got to do, and here are the incentives that you'll receive if you do it, and here's the monitoring system. In economics, that's called principal agent theory. In Britain and a few other countries, that same model that firms were supposed to follow, contracts, monitoring, top-down supervision, scrutiny, that was followed in the state, in the public sector as well, where it was catastrophic. Britain's had an annual survey called the Jobs and Skills Survey, and it asks the same question for 25 years. Have you got enough autonomy in your job to do it properly, to your own satisfaction? And 25 years ago, most people said yes. Now, most people say no. There's a 40% drop in yes, because most people are now captured, trapped in this structure of contracts, incentives, monitoring. What goes in that system is trust. So we've moved from a system in which firms were morally load-bearing to a system in which the firm is just there to maximize the profits of shareholders, and itself the firm's disappeared as a moral entity. It's just this structure of contracts. There's no room for morality in there. The same sort of thing has happened with families, certainly in my own country, hopefully less so in yours. Because what's happened is that the notion that families can be morally load-bearing has gradually disappeared under the weight of individualism, libertarianism. So we've got a belief of the state as the only actor capable of bearing obligations. And then the state itself has this structure of how do you get greedy, lazy, selfish people to behave properly? And that's the incentive monitoring structure. And down at the bottom are individuals. So in the era when I grew up, and indeed in the 1840s, there were a number of morally load-bearing actors. There was families, there was firms, there was local communities, as well as the state, and as well as individual people. But what's happened is the obligations have all floated up, taken off firms and families and local communities. The obligations are all with the state, and the only thing that's left is the individual. And so modern politics is organized around a tension between the state trying to fulfill obligations which it's overburdened with, and individuals pushing back, demanding freedom and liberty. That structure cannot work.
Yeah. So
We've separated obligations from rights. The genius of the cooperative movement was that the rights you generated were perfectly matched by the obligations people took on. That's mutuality. The obligations match the rights. And now we've got a severance. The obligations have gone up and the rights have showered down.
Yeah. So by destroying trust and mutuality, capitalism threatens families, it also affirms the way it used to work, also states. What about democracy? Because the one place in which capitalism seems to be doing extraordinarily well is in China, and there seems to be no contradiction at all with the fact that democracy is not around. Is there an intrinsic? I mean, does capitalism need democracy? Does democracy needs capitalism? That we know, right?
Yeah.
But capitalism does not necessarily care about democracy. It can thrive without it, right? As China shows.
Yeah, as China shows, and that's right. But the tragedy is our democracy has polarized into rival ideologies. It's ceased to be driven by the pragmatism of here are the anxieties of ordinary people, let's deal with those anxieties. And that's been the big failure. We've got the ideology of the right, which says markets will work on capitalism will work on autopilot, all we need to do is deregulate. That was the insanity which started in the 1980s. You don't need the state. Get the state out of the way. The state is the problem, as Ronald Reagan said. Right? And so that's the ideology of the right. And the ideology of the left became this sort of social paternalism, the top-down, we're the saints at the top, and we will create a structure of basically authority, and we'll shower rights down. But we are the ones who are going to be morally load-bearing. Right?
But then, if Thatcher and Reagan, the inequalities of the 2008 financial crisis, they've led to bankrupted capitalism. Why is it that, with the probably only exception of Greece, in which there was actually kind of a revolution or a change coming from the left, these disenfranchised cities and workers have mostly turned politics to the right? Yeah. That is, they voted right, in a sense they voted wrong, if you allow me, okay, instead of voting left. Why is it?
Because the both the mainstream right and the mainstream left were basically talking ideologies. And the only people talking, actually addressing the new anxieties were the populist politicians. They were talking about the right things, the things that actually were the concerns of ordinary people. Of course, they had absolutely no solutions. What they came up with was snake oil. But they were talking about the right things. What we desperately need is for the mainstream parties to actually start talking about the real concerns of ordinary people, and coming up with sometimes the honest statement will be, we don't know how to deal with this. But the right thing to do is to come out with Draghi's statement for the euro, we're going to do whatever it takes. And that licenses you to try different things. Politicians are deeply reluctant to come out with a statement which admits they don't have all the answers. Pragmatism demands not only that you can't know how the world works, it's too complex. And so it's perfectly legitimate to say sometimes, here's a new problem, we don't know how to fix it. We don't know exactly how to bring productive jobs to places where people belong, but we know that's what needs to happen. And we're going to try things. Once you try things, you then need to evaluate. You need to learn what's working. And our politicians, first, never like to admit they don't know what they're doing, and secondly, they never like to evaluate what they try. Because they only try one thing, they assert confidently it will work, and then they know it might not, and so they don't want to look.
Yeah. So then you strike a kind of very delicate compromise between these narratives when you do this series of mea culpas, saying trade and globalization has gone too far, regulation is not enough, immigration is an issue we shall discuss, we cannot avoid, apart from mea culpa on academics and so on, which is very interesting as well. But there are some controversies and the controversial points in the book. The one on immigration comes also from your previous book on Exodus, so you're familiar with this. But can you, to which extent maybe for the audience also, what you say on immigration, how far and how close is it from those who actually have banked on that for their electoral radical push for politicians, and how needed it is to get immigration right from your point of view in order to get right this debate?
Look, quite clearly what the populists are doing are trying to create an enemy within. Immigrants as enemies. Immigrants as the cause of the problem, right? And that's loathsome, right? But we do need an honest assessment of that there is no theorem in economics which says everybody benefits from immigration. None, right? It would be wildly unlikely, right? So let's have a look at some of the practical consequences of free movement within Europe, right? One of the phenomena is that the people who have the biggest incentive to move are the highly skilled leaving low-income areas, because that's where the income differentials are biggest. And so, for example, in Romania, about a third of Romania's doctors has left Romania and moved to be much better off doctors in France, Germany. Now, you can view that from the economic lens of efficiency, and economists will say, oh, well, because those doctors are earning more in France than they were earning in small-town Romania, that's a gain in efficiency, right? And with appropriate compensation, anything that's an improvement in efficiency could make everybody better off, right? But there is no mechanism for compensation, right? It's not even clear how you would compensate a small town that lost its doctor, right?
People send money back home, they would sell, with immigrants tend to sell a lot of money back home, which pushes development.
So there are some beneficial things about it. I'm not saying, right? But I'm saying in that instance, if small-town Romania loses a third of its doctors and they're nearly all from small towns, did we mean to do that? Right? Did we mean to do it? Did we think about it as a possible consequence? I think we didn't. It's great if you're a Romanian doctor. It's great if you're a French citizen who gets a Romanian doctor. But if you're a family in small-town Romania and your kid's sick and the doctor's left, it's not great. Right? It's not great. And what are we going to say to those small towns? We're going to say, you should all leave. Right? Well, that can't be right. The answer cannot be that what Europe is about is the poorer regions emptying. Right? Europe really has to be about convergence, seems to me. Convergence between countries, convergence between regions. It's about catching up by the poorer. And when Europe, if we go back far enough, that's what Europe was doing. It was helping Portugal, helping Spain, helping Eastern Europe to catch up. But free movement actually doesn't help the catch-up process. The most extreme example of out-migration in modern history is the emigration from Ireland that started in the 1840s. And that went on for 150 years. The population of Ireland halved before Ireland started to catch up. And it didn't catch up because of emigration. It caught up because of inward investment. So the process of out-migration of the skilled is obviously somewhat destabilizing. Mm-hmm. So if we look at modern Greece, we've got again a massive exodus of the young and skilled.
But you make the argument too that it's not only that economically it's not necessarily a win-win, but also that culturally you fear that more diverse communities would see these moral reciprocity links being weakened by diversity and by people from the outside coming in.
So that's potentially so. It depends. I mean, we need to. It's really important that we don't endanger these structures of reciprocal obligation. Right? That's what humans are rather good at doing. Building a sense of community, which then builds these reciprocal obligations. And people have a strong sense of belonging to place. There's a handful of the population likes to think of itself as footloose and fancy-free, but most of us actually have a sense of belonging to place. And so if the only answer provided by globalization is leave your place, that's a big welfare loss, right? And if we look at London, which is an extreme case, London is by far the most productive place in Britain. It's, in terms of per capita income, it's about 70% higher than the national average. But if you look at the evidence on well-being, London's a catastrophe. It's the lowest level of well-being in the whole of the United Kingdom. So the mapping from inputs into income is very efficient. The mapping from income into well-being is really seriously inefficient. Right? And so maybe London is full of people who've lost a sense of belonging and lost a sense of community.
Which leads to other probably controversial topic I've seen from Spain, which is when you see the European Union as something which is not entirely friendly in terms of supporting communities or destroying this sense of civicness and so on. And on the one hand, you praise Macron because he takes on nationalism by defending patriotism, but at the same time, Macron is very clearly talking about European sovereignty and an ardent defender of deeper political integration. In the case of Britain, I would say that British workers have their rights more guaranteed by being member of the European Union than by just being an island floating kind of a Singapore in the middle of the Atlantic, right? They should compete on low salaries and cheap services if they Brexit, right? So is the European Union so unfriendly to this kind of engagement that you care, or is it depends on?
The European Union is a huge asset, and my hands are completely clean here. I did a video that went viral before the referendum, pleading for a Remain vote, and 6 months ago I did an article which went viral and got 2 million people to sign up for revoking Article 50. Right, so my hands on this matter are clean.
Good.
But and as you say, I'm a big fan of Macron. But I think there are two potential meanings to European identity and to building European identity. Is it a complement to national identity or a substitute for it. And if it's a complement to national identity, that's great. Because what it's doing is encouraging the successful within a nation to say, not only do you have obligations to the less successful within your own nation, you're still a citizen of your country, but you also have obligations to the citizens of poorer countries, less successful countries in Europe. Yeah? That's an extension of the sense of obligation of the successful. And if you like, my bottom line is I want to extend the sense and revive a sense of obligation by the successful. But if you mean that Europe is a substitute for national identity, then that's very, potentially very dangerous. Because clearly you can understand why you might want to do that in the 1950s when you'd had all these European wars. The chances of France and Germany going back to international warfare are somewhat lower than the chance that Europe will be hit by a large meteor, frankly. I mean, it's just not in the sense of serious things to entertain. But the sense of shared obligation which we built through shared national identity in that period after the Second World War really was a hugely valuable asset to the poorer parts of society. And so if the successful metropolitans say, I'm not a national at all, I'm a European citizen, right? Then they basically get a free ride. They've no longer obligations to the rest of their to their less fortunate fellow citizens within their country, and their obligations to the less successful regions of Europe are trivial because the European budget is so trivial. You know? National budget's about 40% of GDP. The Brussels budget is about 1% of GDP. So, you know, if it's a substitute for national identity, then the rich have a very easy time of it.
Before we move to the debate, because I'm sure there will be questions from the public, there are two more issues I wanted to raise with you. One is also another controversial theme in your book is families. How, you speak of social maternalism. Maybe this is a concept people want to hear what it's about. And you advocate for a role of public policies in helping repair families. Isn't it a bit of a delicate thing, and how would you do it? What is the role of the state in fixing and helping families be fixed or fix themselves?
Yeah, so there's an important contrast in the book between paternalism, which is the state knows best and it's going to use power relationships to force behavior on those beneath the state, and maternalism, which is a system of supporting potentially many different organizations to be morally load-bearing in society. Spain, I don't think, has this problem to anything like the extent that Britain has had it. Britain really pioneered social paternalism in the family, and it was really very, very, very destructive. Since writing the book, I've teamed up with a woman called Hilary Cotton, who comes at this exactly the opposite end from me. She's a social activist who's been trying to help stressed families. But we've reached exactly the same conclusion. So Hilary Cotton has a devastating critique of British social services paternalism. There's a book called Radical Help, and there's a 20-minute TED Talk. So in 20 minutes you can listen to Hilary Cotton, and you'll get the hideous truth, right? Which is that British social services has become organized entirely as a top-down structure in which, under the name of safeguarding, what is being safeguarded is the directors of these organizations from being legally liable for anything that goes wrong. And so 86% of the time of social workers who are supposed to be helping poor families is taken not with poor families, but with feeding this system of monitoring and control. That leaves 14% of the time to actually work with the families, but it's much worse than that, because nearly all that 14% is trying to get the data off the families needed to feed the monitoring. Yeah? So I'm looking after my niece's children since the age of 1 and 2 because of social paternalism. So just to put it brutally, my niece, when she was pregnant with my daughter, Stephanie, social services told her when she was 5 months pregnant, "We will remove your child 10 minutes after birth." And sure enough, there was a policeman on duty in the maternity ward, and Stephanie was removed. Now, that stressed that pregnant woman, obviously. Right? The news that when she was 5 months pregnant, that your baby is going to be removed at birth. What we now know is that that sort of stress produces irreversible damage. There's a new Finnish study which has followed over 40 years the effects of stress in pregnancy. And those fetuses that were stressed are now 40-year-old adults, and they are significantly and substantially dysfunctional. That is irreversible damage just even before you get to a baby from the stress. And that's avoidable. You can do much better by trying to give the support that shores up a family instead of scrutinizing it. And the key here is that support can only work if it's trusted, and you can only get trust if you separate that support from any system of scrutiny that you've got. And the British system is really organized on scrutiny. 70,000 British children are removed from their families and brought up in what's called foster care. Foster care has two features which mean it cannot work. The foster parents are paid, so it's a financial relationship, and it's temporary. And so these children being brought up by people who are paid to bring them up, and it's temporary. Anybody who's got a kid knows that's fundamentally flawed. Right? So there's 70,000 children in this temporary care. In the year that we managed to get Alex and Stephanie out of this system, and we were lucky because there was a new legal structure introduced, which the state's trying to get rid of now. A new legal structure which, if you were a relative, you've got a fast track. Right? So we managed it. In the year we got those two out, there were only 60 children adopted in the whole country. So 70,000 mired in this mess, a vortex that cannot work. And out of 70,000, 60, not 60,000, 60, escape the system. Right? That is social paternalism at its most extreme. Right? You've not got that in Spain. Don't get it.
Good. So many or a good number of fixes that you advocate for in order to repair these broken communities require bad news for some people, taxes, you know. So is taxation at the end of the day, the place around which everything will, turns around? Because
taxation is a necessary part of the solution, and the people who have to pay that tax are going to be the metropolitan successful. And I'm a professor of economics, so I've teamed up with another professor of economics, and we've got a very fancy analysis which can be simply expressed. And that is that, think of all these highly productive people in the metropole, right? You, me, right? We think of ourselves, why are we so fantastically productive? And the natural explanation is because we're so fantastically clever, right? And that is part of the explanation, but it's only part. One reason why we're so very productive in that metropole is that we're all agglomerated together in that metropole. If you put those same skilled people spread out in remote regions, they'd be a lot less productive. By bringing them all together, that makes them a lot more productive. Why are they all together in these metropoles? Because for hundreds of years, the whole nation has invested in the physical and legal infrastructure that has made these metropoles possible. And so a lot of what's called the rents of agglomeration, this huge increase in productivity, in London, this 70% uplift over the rest of the country, actually belongs to everybody. And so there's a strong ethical case for saying, tax that. Tax that. It doesn't, those rents of agglomeration are being captured by the skilled. They don't earn them, they're capturing them. Right? Now, so tax is part of it, but then there's a question of what do you do with that tax? And the answer is you don't just transfer consumption. This is the big mistake of a lot of social democracy, is thinking that what you need to do is just redistribute consumption. And that isn't right, because people are not ultimately consumers. We get dignity from being able to contribute, from being productive. And so what you need to distribute is the capacity to be productive. And that comes in two halves. One is bringing productive jobs to communities where people belong. We can't do that with every tiny little community, but we can make sure that every region has a successful, thriving city, so that you don't have to leave the region. You can take pride in your region. And a lot of belonging is at that level. And the other half is, how do you turn this fetus into a 20-something-year-old that's productive? And I've talked about the early stages. We know that by the time a child is 6, its performance in schooling at the age of 12 is very closely predicted. And so 0 to 6 is one important phase. I've talked about the family. The other thing that is very important in the book is preschool. I don't know the system you've got here. I do know the system in France, which I think is really pretty good, École maternelle. We lived in France when our eldest son was 2.5, so from 2.5 to 5 he was in École maternelle. What he taught him it socialized him. And so that by the time he came to proper school, he was socialized and so able to acquire the cognitive knowledge. And we now know from research that getting the social skills early is the foundation for getting the cognitive skills. We also know that in employment, the non-cognitive skills, the socialization, is as important as the cognitive. Right? If we go to the other end, what happens post-school vocational training? We know that the best in Europe for vocational training is Switzerland. And so we can learn from the best. What do the Swiss do? Switzerland has one of the top 10 universities in the world, but 60% of the Swiss choose to take the vocational route instead. It's equally prestigious. It's 3- and 4-year courses, certified, very fancy. You can run a Swiss bank through the vocational route. So there's no status difference between university and vocational training. It's wildly expensive because it's paid. You're paid in vocational training. Wildly expensive. Half of the costs are paid for by firms. And because firms are paying so much of the money, they get in the kitchen of training. And that seems to be the vital secret in vocational training. You need firms to be intimately involved so that the training leads to a productive job.